The next question comes from Max, although several others have touched on this as well. And the essence of the question is, why does Iowa get to go first, and why are so many other people in other states upset about it? And I have to admit, this is a question I've addressed quite a few times because a variety of reporters have asked me about it. And in some sense, Iowa is important to the process mainly because it's first rather than it's first because it's important. That said, what I also tell reporters is that over the years, given the 30 or so years that we've been doing this, Iowa has basically become important because it's in some sense a bellwether. It's always been a swing state, or at least it has in the last several presidential elections. And so the extent that you do get some people complaining about Iowa perhaps being too rural, too old because of an older population demographic, or not diverse enough in a variety of ways, doesn't take into account the fact that the Republicans are maybe more conservative in some respects, but not all. The Democrats are more liberal in some respects, but not all. And of course, we have a large contingent of independent voters who fall right in the middle, and that's what makes Iowa not a red state, not a blue state, but a very purple state. And that gives a good indication as to how voters in other states might very well choose their candidates too. No state's going to be exactly representative of the nation as a whole, but you have to pick a state where there's a good opportunity for candidates to make their case to the voters. And this to some extent gets to the small state versus large state question, because of course people say, oh, well, there isn't enough population in Iowa, and especially given how many people turn out for the caucuses as opposed to a primary. But the people that turn out for the caucuses are those that are most actively engaged in the process, and they take their job seriously in terms of looking at the candidates and vetting them, looking at their strengths, their weaknesses, their pros, their cons, and determining whether these men and women would be an appropriate nominee for their party, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans. If the primary process began in a large state such as California, Texas, Florida, it would be so large that no candidate without huge amounts of name recognition and funding would be able to compete. So, for example, in 2008, a candidate like Barack Obama, although a rising star in the Democratic Party, would have had little chance against the much better known and better funded John Edwards or Hillary Clinton. Now, some may think that's a good thing, but just in terms of the success of the process, it did mean that Obama was able to present his message to the people, hone his message here in Iowa, let people know that he was in fact a viable candidate, and go on to other states and ultimately win the nomination. This time, a similar candidate could be Rick Santorum, who put in a lot of hard work. He had fairly good name recognition for those that follow the political process, given his years in Congress, but he didn't have as much as some of the other candidates. He also didn't have the fundraising, so he had to do the grassroots retail politicking that we like here in Iowa. And as a result, he ultimately became the caucus winner, or in the sense of right there at the top. Right now, as I speak this, there's still some question as to whether he was 8 votes behind or maybe a couple ahead. We've got one last precinct to resolve. But either way, he still won in the sense that he came in effectively a tie, and he would not have been able to do that in any kind of larger state where he wouldn't have been able to compete. So people can certainly criticize Iowa in a variety of ways, but there are many positive reasons for Iowa to go first and to continue to go first in the presidential nomination process. The next question comes from Matt, who asks, is Romney going to win this nomination? Well, as I'm speaking this, we're just a few days past the Iowa caucuses and just before the New Hampshire primary. So depending on what happens in that New Hampshire primary and beyond may influence what I would answer. But right now, at least, it seems that Romney does in fact still have the inside track to the nomination. He effectively won the Iowa caucus, although some people think that it wasn't a win because Rick Santorum was so close to him, and we don't quite know at this point what the final tally is going to be because there still seems to be some question in one precinct. But regardless of whether it ends up actually being first or second, they were so close that I think Romney was able to hang on to the support that he had from 4 years ago, and given the lesser amount of effort and time that he put into the state, that's a pretty good showing for him. And for him, it was also a matter of managing the expectations. Unlike 4 years ago where he was expected to win, and so a second place finish was seen as a loss, this time I think he can pretty well, and he has, claimed the Iowa result as a win for him, as it was for Santorum too. So effectively 2 winners out of the Iowa caucus this year. He's expected to win New Hampshire by a large margin, and as long as Santorum or some of the other candidates don't cut into that large margin significantly, he'll go into South Carolina with a fairly large bit of momentum. Now, the challenge for Romney in South Carolina and on into Florida is that, at least until recently, Gingrich was polling ahead of Romney. And if the more conservative candidates, Santorum, Gingrich, and Perry at this point, are able to coalesce around one candidate, so not so much those candidates but their supporters are able to coalesce around one candidate, that would be a significant challenge to Romney. But as long as they're all competing for the conservative vote, that splits it in a way just as it did here in Iowa, and could very well allow Romney to pick up the delegates in those states. And Romney is well prepared to go for the long game in terms of fighting this out down the road. So the longer it takes for some of those other candidates to drop out, the better chance that Romney will have to ultimately get the Republican nomination. The next question comes from Katie, who asks, what kind of voter turnout was this year's caucus compared to previous years, when hopeful presidentials might have inspired more hope in Republicans? 4 years ago, both the Democrats and the Republicans had record turnouts, and this is not surprising given that both parties were having a contested caucus. This year, there didn't seem to be quite as much excitement, partly again because only the Republicans had a contested caucus. But as it turns out, the Republicans did increase the number of people at the caucus. 4 years ago, it was about 119,000 that attended the Republican caucus. This year, it was about 122,000. But given the increase in Republican registrations from 4 years ago, that percentage was actually slightly lower. And that was a bit of a surprise, given that the weather was good and there didn't seem to be a clear favorite. Sometimes when you have a clear favorite, people might say, oh, well, I know so-and-so is going to win, and so I'm not going to go to the caucus. But the top three finishers, Romney, Santorum, and Paul, were all pretty well bunched together, and other people were making a play, so it seemed like maybe people would turn out. But I think what actually ended up happening was that because they were bunched together, and because people weren't sure perhaps who they were going to support, polls right before the caucuses suggested that a very high percentage of Iowa caucus goers were still unsure or not really sold on any particular candidate, that ultimately might have caused some people to think that they just weren't enthusiastic enough to turn out. And so as a result, even though turnout in terms of the raw number was up, the percentage was down a little bit, and certainly the people in the Republican Party are going to try to work to make sure that turnout next time is going to be higher than it has been in the past.